Tonight finds us in Aldershot, and welcome to Question Time. And good evening to you at home, good evening to our audience here, and welcome to our panel, the former leader of the Conservative Party, Michael Howard, Labour's Shadow Energy Secretary, Caroline Flint, Liberal Democrat who used to be in the Cabinet looking after children's affairs, Sarah Teather, the Daily Mail columnist, Amanda Platell, and the comedian and television presenter, Griff Rhys Jones. Excellent, thank you very much. A question from Hector Cameron to kick off, please.
Why should some people get more than £500 per week on benefit when I only earn £450 a week working 46 hours?
Why should some people, this is what happened this week, was the introduction of the cap on benefits at £500. Why should some people get over 500 when I only earn 450? Says Hector Cameron. As what, incidentally?
I do CNC engineering.
Engineering?
CNC work on
right.
CNC machines. You probably wouldn't know what that is, but
no, I'm afraid I don't. I won't ask you, because
yeah.
Amanda Platell.
Well, Hector, the simple truth is it is completely unfair that people who go out to work like you take home less money than people who stay at home. Now, this is quite, it's quite controversial, this cap, but it's probably the most popular thing that this government's ever brought in. I wish they were doing it, well, I know that Ian Duncan Smith's doing it through conviction. I'm not sure that David Cameron has embraced it for the same reason. But, you know, basically the cap's £26,000, which is the average take-home income. And you would have to be earning £35,000 a year to have that £500 in your pocket. And all I would say is there had to be a huge change, and these are huge changes, but underneath of them all is a moral argument that anyone who goes out to work should not be worse off than someone who stays at home. And there are just two simple points to make here. The benefit system is there has always been there for people who cannot look after themselves and for people who fall on hard times. It is not a lifestyle choice. And too often in this country, that's why it's become, and that's why it is so unfair to people like you.
Sarah Teather, you're part of this coalition government until a bit ago. You're still there, presumably supporting it. What do you think?
I mean, I think the problem with a lot of the debate around this is that it misses the human cost involved. And I know that it sounds like a large amount of money, but if you are one of my constituents living in an area with very high housing cost, you're going to face a really invidious choice when this benefit cap comes in. You will lose perhaps many hundreds of pounds, and the choice then for you is do you move a long way away? Do you move perhaps a long way out of London, away from your support network, away from where you're going to have any chance of getting work, where your children are in school? Or do you go into a much smaller property and become very acutely overcrowded? Or do you split up your family? So we have to remember what the real cost of this type of policy is. And I don't think it's going to save any money. I mean, all of the evidence suggests that it's going to save very little money. It doesn't seem to be getting people back into work. I think, in fact, it's likely to be counterproductive as people get moved a long way away from where they live and where they've previously been in work. And the danger is just that it's a political device. For me, this is about demonstrating whose side you're on, and I don't really like that type of politics.
Go back to the questioner.
If the landlords know that they get this rent from the government, so that they keep the rents high. If they know that the rents are going to be low, they're going to have to lower their rents that they charge.
Michael Howard.
Well, the question is right. Of course, Sarah's right too, that there is a human cost involved, and all change of this kind will lead to some hard cases, and that is very, very regrettable. But the truth is that, quite apart from the moral argument which Amanda put forward, which I agree with, we have to understand that as a country we are in hock, and we just can't afford to carry on as we have been carrying on.
But Michael,
we are borrowing.
Yes, save any money.
It will save money. It's bound to save money.
But why is it bound to save money?
It's bound to save money because people will be getting less. Let me finish. People will be getting less than they otherwise would have got. And we are in a situation where we are borrowing money, believe it or not, from countries which have a far lower standard of living than we have, which don't have any welfare at all. And it's completely unsustainable. So we've got to start living within our means. And this is one of the steps which is necessary
I need to pick up some of these points because
hold on a second. I'll come to Karen Flint in a minute. The figure offered is 110 million a year savings. Do you accept that figure?
I don't know whether that's absolutely right. But these figures add up. This is not the only step which the government's taking in order to reduce the welfare bill. And you have to add them all together. And we have to save money in order to start living within
I'll come back to you, Sarah. Let Caroline Flint come in.
The government's borrowing 245 billion more pounds than they were planning to, because their economic policies are failing and they haven't got the jobs and growth to get this country back on its feet. And in answer to Hector's question, I fundamentally believe that actually people should be better off in work than on benefits. I also believe in a benefit cap, but one that can work. And the problem is that because there are different housing costs around the country, the government have introduced this sort of standardised benefit cap that is going to cause problems. We argued that actually we should have localised benefit caps that did reflect some of the housing costs. And the truth is, particularly in London, and you make a very valid point about whether this will bring the rents down. On the front page of the Evening Standard tonight, it says that rents have gone up by 8 times in London. And the truth is, because there are so many people looking for private rented accommodation, and because we haven't got enough social homes, council homes to put these people into, we have got a problem that is going to emerge because of this. And the government say they want to tackle idleness. Well, why are they making changes that are going to take money away from people who are actually in work and supporting them in work? It doesn't add up. They are putting through incompetent policies that actually aren't going to achieve what you want.
Are you saying the principle is right, but the execution of it is wrong?
I think the principle is right. I think the execution is wrong. I don't think it takes account of different housing costs around the country, and it doesn't solve the problem. We need to build more social homes for people. That is vital.
We certainly do, and the number of social housing units fell dramatically under the last Labour government. But I'd like to ask Caroline this question. If you support regional caps on benefits, do you support regional benefit levels to start with? Because you can't have one without the other.
No, I think there is a different issue when it comes to housing. If you look around the country, Michael, you can see that there are disparities in terms of housing costs. The ability in my constituency, for example, in Doncaster, for people on relatively low medium incomes to buy a house is far greater opportunity than people on low middle incomes in, say, London. So I think it needs to reflect that. And the truth is, people in work are having tax credits taken away from them. So the government can't argue that they're supporting people in work, because 2/3 of the people affected by some of those changes are working families who are trying to make ends meet and make work pay.
The problem with this one overall cap is what it does is to disentangle the link that we have at the moment that recognises that housing costs different amounts in different areas. It's the reason why housing benefit rates are different in different areas. So it doesn't make any sense.
What really confuses me about this argument is, you know, I've lived in Britain for a long time now, more than 25 years. I've known loads of people who, through their circumstances, when their families grew or they lost their job or they got another job, they moved. They took their kids out of schools. They accepted that you don't have a God-given right to stay in the same house. And I think that your protestations and Caroline's seem to say that it's a different set of rules. This goes back to the moral argument.
It depends a little bit on
a different set of rules.
Where are they going to go, Amanda? Where are these people going to go? There isn't the social housing for them to go into.
We have to start the inner city of London. And I think it's been very courageous.
We're going to end up with no mixed communities.
We've got a lot of people in the audience wanting to speak, but Griff, your turn.
Well, I'm sitting on the edge here. And I basically agree with everybody and disagree with them all at the same time. And the problem that comes here is that we have a welfare system that has not really been sorted for quite a long time. It's been fiddled with. And we live in an unsustainable equation. The equation goes like this. Our welfare is billowing, and it was predicted at the time of the Lisbon Accord by economists who came together and said, look, Western Europe is not basically going to be able to afford what it wants to do in the way of welfare. And it will have to take some pain along the way. But what I also recognise, and what is very, very true, is that because we have left it so late, because we're now engaged in a form of tinkering, we're going to cause some real, genuine pain to people who have become reliant on a system which is so complicated that as we sit to discuss it here, we can't even find a sort of conclusion about what we're talking about. And this is the first of 20, at least 20 measures which are going to play with a really complicated welfare system. We have a situation in this country where we have encouraged people, quite rightly, to stay in higher education till the age of 21 or later, and then we retire at a relatively early age. And then we try to live, thanks to the National Health Service, till beyond 100.
Of course, that's true.
And under those circumstances, the actual time we spend as productive people putting money into the pot is not quite working. It's not adding up.
Yeah. The woman there in the striped shirt. Yeah, striped thing, yes.
I would quite like to agree with Amanda. The thing I don't understand is why there seem to be two different rules. One if you're on benefits and one if you're working. I work. I can't afford to live in London. So guess what? I don't.
Yeah. And yes, woman up there in white.
There's only a certain number of people in the country that the money is taken from their taxes to pay the benefits, and we can't already sort out the benefits that people are getting. So why is it that when people from abroad come into our country, they're not here for very long, before they also are receiving benefits? Now, we can't make what we've got go round with people that we've got here already without this additional number of people coming in from outside.
All right. And hold on a second. We'll take the woman there, and then I come to you, Sarah. Yes.
The one point that everybody seems to have overlooked is that the vast majority of benefit recipients in this country are working people. And what the benefit system is actually doing is it's subsidising big companies to pay starvation wages. And the solution would be to raise the minimum wage. If the minimum wage were raised to a living standard, then not only would fewer people claim benefits, but there would be greater tax revenue as well.
And are you in favour, in that context, of a cap on welfare payments?
No, I don't think it's the answer.
Michael Howard, what do you say to the idea of raising the minimum wage?
Well, it sounds very attractive in principle, but there would be many companies that simply couldn't afford to pay a higher minimum wage, and they would then start laying people off. They might even go out of business. And the result might be that you would actually have fewer people in work than you started off with. And that would not be what you want, and it certainly wouldn't be what I want.
Isn't that the same argument the Tories used when it was first introduced?
And that it all depends on the level at which you pitch the minimum wage. Exactly. And
£50 an hour.
And if you increase it, you may well get the kind of consequence.
But it is the argument you used when the minimum wage first came in. You said all hell will be let loose, jobs will disappear,
depending on the level.
Well, the level it was fixed, did they disappear? No.
But
it was fixed at a low level.
But the answer to this is also about access to jobs. There's something like 1.5 million people working part-time who are desperate to work full-time. And they really do want to do that, but the jobs are not there. Okay. And the truth is, unemployment has gone up again in the figures this week. Unemployment is higher today than it was in 2010. And Osborne and Cameron have to listen to organisations like the IMF and others, who say you have to do something to tackle growth, because the way out of this is through jobs and growth and giving people the chance to earn more.
All right, let's just come back to the question Hector asked originally. The man there in the very back row, you, sir.
The majority of welfare goes on pensions, not on benefits. Shouldn't we be focusing on pensions instead? And to the lady talking about immigrants claiming benefits, the majority of immigrants, the claim rate amongst immigrants is much lower of benefits than it is amongst the general population.
So are you saying you'd favour a cut in state pensions? as a way of reducing the welfare bill?
I think we're focusing on the wrong thing by focusing on welfare and a divisive campaign by the Conservatives, when the whole point is that we should be focusing on pensions, but we won't, because Cameron's made a promise about not cutting pensions, because that's where his voter base is.
But you would like to see pensions cut?
I think it has to be put on the table. Pensions have to be put on the table instead of this divisive attack on people on benefits.
And the woman here in the third row.
People on benefits.
And the woman here in the third row.
Honestly, I think instead of cutting benefits, we should be not encouraging big developers to move into our areas. I'm part of a campaign to save a company to stop it from being turned into a McDonald's drive-through. It does not offer a full-time livable wage. Instead of encouraging people to go to these companies, why not encourage local businesses? Why not encourage local communities to look after themselves, to basically stop other people from going on benefits?
OK, and the man up there on the far left. You, sir.
Just want to ask Michael Howard, Tesco spent £1.2 billion in costs winding up their US arm this week. Couldn't that be spent on giving their workers a better wage?
Well, Tesco will make their own decisions. They're an independent private company, and they will make their own decisions as to how that money can best be used. And the more successful Tesco are, the more shops they open, then the more people they employ, and the better off everyone is. They're the best people to decide how to spend that money.
What you're saying is that they actually can't afford it. Well, clearly they can, because they've, like I said, spent £1.2 billion.
No, I'm not saying they can't afford it. I'm saying they're the best people to decide how to use their resources, and they're using it in a way which makes them more prosperous, which creates more jobs, and which is for the benefit of the country.
I'll take one more point from over there, and then, Sarah, 1 point from you, if you would. Yes?
Just going back to the point about a living wage.
Yes.
You say that companies may not be happy to pay it, but yet again this week we found out another company paid no tax to this country, and it seems that your government are more concerned with keeping your friends in business happy and than keeping the welfare and the happiness of your population in general, because you'd rather not upset the businesses and upset people who are trying to make their way in life.
I just want to come back on some of the points being raised.
Just one point.
Well, consistently,
people go on much longer on this.
Consistently, people are saying that it's going to save a lot of money. I think we have to put it in perspective. A lot of the people in my constituency who are going to be affected by this have been housed by the council. That means the council's going to have to move them. There are going to be costs. So even if it looks as if there are some savings in welfare, there are going to be massive costs to councils in order to deal with this. There aren't going to be any savings. And I'm afraid Eric Pickles knows this, because we know that he was writing letters around government that ended up in the Observer about 18 months ago. So we know full well that it really aren't going to be any real savings.
Your Liberal colleagues have voted with this in government, Sarah.
Well,
you may not have done, but the rest of them did.
I didn't vote with it.
You seem to differ from the government on quite a lot of things.
Not on quite a lot of things, no, not on quite a lot of things.
Do you still approve of the coalition? Or
I do approve of the coalition.
Do you? Sure.
But on this, I don't like this type of politics. The setting up of dividing lines just to prove which side you're on.
Griff.
It's not good for the country.
I just wanted to say that the examples of bad practice, whether it's people exploiting the system, the welfare system, or people being hurt, individuals being hurt by the welfare system, or indeed individual businesses that don't pay any tax and become a sort of exemplar of bad behaviour, don't actually help us with trying to deal with the major problem. The major problem is still there, and exceptional cases which tend to become part of political language don't really help us in this problem.
We must go on to another question. Thanks. It's a good debate, and you can join in it on text or Twitter, as you know. Our hashtag's BBCQT. You can follow us at BBC Question Time, and if you want to text, 83981 is the number. The red button, if you push it, will tell you what others are texting. A question now from Alison Fox, please. Alison Fox.
Are we all Thatcherites now?
Are we all Thatcherites now? This is in the light of what the Prime Minister said yesterday before Lady Thatcher's funeral.
Yes.
On the radio, apparently. He said, in a sense, we are all Thatcherites now. So we just want to tease this out a bit with Michael Howard, perhaps. Michael.
Well, in a sense, we are. No surprise that I agree with the Prime Minister.
What does it mean?
Well, I think it means this. Let me suggest a test which you can apply to this argument. We've had 13 years of Labour government between Margaret Thatcher's leaving office and today. If you look back on the major reforms which she put in place, reform of the trade unions, privatisation, 13 years of Labour government didn't reverse any of them. Look at the tax rate. Not long before she became Prime Minister, income tax was at 98%. It was reduced gradually under her office to 40 pence in the pound, and it stayed the maximum rate of income tax at 40 pence in the pound until just a few days before the 2010 election. So if you look back at the major reforms which she put in place, very controversial at the time, they've largely been accepted. There's the gap between the major parties now is much smaller than it was when I entered Parliament in 1983. Michael Foot was leading the Labour Party. They were committed to more public ownership, higher taxation, unilateral nuclear disarmament. The gap has closed largely because the Labour Party has moved towards us and not vice versa. And in that sense, we are all Thatcherites now.
So you mean we're all Conservatives now?
I think Margaret Thatcher won the major arguments, and that's responsible for a new, divisive figure though she was in her time, a new consensus. Of course, we don't agree on everything, but on the major issues, yes, we are all Thatcherites now.
Caroline Flint.
I'm certainly not a Thatcherite. I profoundly disagree with many policies that Margaret Thatcher led on in government. I think she oversaw mass unemployment in our country. I think even though clearly in terms of parts of our industry during that time it had to change, I think she devastated communities by treating hard-working people in our industrial heartlands as the enemy within. And I think some of the legacy of Margaret Thatcher...
That was specifically the miners, wasn't it? That wasn't a general attack on people in industry. It was about the miners' strike.
If you look, and what she did though, David, was rather in terms of her head-to-head with people like Arthur Scargill. She broadened that out to devastate mining communities and steel communities. And the legacy of that is there today. Many people, many men, we were just talking about welfare, many men were put on incapacity benefit as a way to hide the unemployment figures. It was unacceptable. It was unacceptable to me that she didn't support economic sanctions against South Africa. It was unacceptable to me that she supported the poll tax. It was unacceptable to me that she stigmatised gay and lesbian people through Section 28. So I am not a Thatcherite, but all parties have to adapt to change. The Labour government introduced a national minimum wage. The Tories and the Liberal Democrats voted against it. They wouldn't change it now. So are they all Blairites?
All right. Why did your two Labour Prime Ministers make a point of inviting Lady Thatcher to number 10, hosting her, shaking hands on the steps? Were you in favour of that?
I think
that not a suggestion that Michael Howard is right?
Look, I don't think that means that they agree with all the policies that she led on in government for 1 minute. And
you wouldn't have invited her to number 10 if you had been Prime Minister.
I think there's lots of things that happen in politics, and rather like the funeral this week, which was agreed to, I understand, I don't know the details of it, by Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. Some of the arrangements were agreed to before. Some of it is about what you do in politics. We do not spend our time in the House of Commons attacking each other in the corridors. I think there'd probably be people who were having strokes and heart attacks if they spent their time so hyped up on that. But you can be polite, you can respect people, and I have said she deserves credit for the fact that she overcame opposition in her party to become the first woman leader. She did win 3 general elections, but I do not believe that overall what she did for our country was good, and also the legacy of that in communities is still being felt today.
Yes.
Thank you. Caroline, you mentioned Mrs Thatcher's policies in South Africa, and 3 weeks ago, there was a wonderful article in the Times by one of her ambassadorial staff that said she was for inclusion because she didn't feel that economic sanctions would be productive and you'd only further isolate South Africa. But yet in your final sentence, you said you had to be polite and respectful, and that's exactly what she was trying to achieve. So whilst there was this outside view that she was being confrontational and gladiatorial with South Africa, that was the furthest thing she wanted to do. She actually wanted to take an inclusive route.
It was confirmed by F.W. de Klerk.
I'm sorry, but
who
at
was
the
responsible for the
time,
changes in
I
South
was
Africa.
involved in campaigning against apartheid in South Africa, but at the time, anti-apartheid and the ANC said we need economic sanctions. That is what they were asking for. People in South Africa, black people, were being treated appallingly.
Yeah.
Their economic circumstances were bad anyway, and that is one thing she
Let's not go
refused
down
to
this
do.
road. All right, that's a specific policy. But what the Prime Minister said was that we are all, in a sense, Thatcherites now. Griff Rhys Jones, do you think we're all Thatcherites now?
Well, we have funerals to reach a state of closure, don't we? And I really think it's time we all moved on. When I was a boy, we were slightly brought up with an obsession with the Second World War. Everything was related to the war, and we couldn't watch a television programme without it being about the war. And now, the only historical thing that seems to have happened to Britain since then is Thatcher. I feel that we are, in a way, Thatcher's children, but one of the things that's really important to me is that we're being accused now, we're digging up apartheid again, and we're digging up all sorts of, either Thatcher was a marvellous thing, but also a sort of rather strange idea that we as a nation have become people who are extremely greedy as a result of Mrs. Thatcher. A sort of a nonsense notion. We are still human beings with our own decisions to make, and we should stick by those, and we should believe in ourselves, and we should start looking to the future instead of referring all the time to what Mrs. Thatcher did and what she achieved.
You could say there's an Attlee generation as well as a Thatcher generation.
Well, we don't hear so much from them, do we, really, in a sort of way these days?
I don't know. Sarah Teather.
Well, I mean, I think we are Thatcher's children. I mean, I certainly, if I think back, I can't remember anything before she came to power.
That's not the lady actually asked, were we Thatcherites?
No, exactly. That's the point. It's what I was about to say. We're Thatcher's children, but I don't think we're all Thatcherites. I'm certainly not a Thatcherite. In terms of my politics, it was formed out of opposing Margaret Thatcher. I mean, I can't remember anything before she came to power, and all of my political growing up was formed by disagreeing with almost everything that she did, and I've continued to disagree with an awful lot of what she did.
Why weren't those things undone then?
Well, I think that's slightly different.
The key things of trade union reform, for instance, wasn't changed. Privatisation.
But I think you can
disagree.
Renationalising
everything.
You can disagree with an awful lot of what might have
been done at the time. These are the main planks that
That doesn't necessarily mean that it's right to undo everything. And I accept that on some things we're not going to go back to suddenly nationalising all of the industries again. But there are lots of things on which I profoundly disagreed and which were reversed and which we wouldn't want to do again. I mean, I profoundly disagree with her attitudes towards Europe, for example, her attitudes towards the poorest, the attitude that she had around unemployment, of thinking it was OK to let unemployment rise, rather than actually seeing that it was really important to really focus on getting people into work.
Will you ever even credit her with the fact that when she came to power, she inherited rising unemployment and she brought it down? It just seems that there are these endless lies, like about South Africa, about the notion of society, about unemployment. She brought unemployment down. There were more people working when she left power. This country was a cot case when she took over. And it was one of the, even Russia wouldn't buy goods from us because they were badly made, they couldn't deliver them on the time, and we couldn't keep to any agenda because of the unions.
Why did the Tories get rid of it, Amanda?
She changed that. Harold Wilson closed more mines than
election,
Margaret Thatcher did. Tony Blair oversaw more of the closure of manufacturing in this country than Margaret Thatcher did. Can we just sort of get a bit of perspective? Without her, this country would be, the cot case of Europe, and it ended up the third or fourth richest economy in the world when she left. That creates jobs, and that created a future for people in this country, and people like me, and I would say, with her example as first woman Prime Minister, people like both of you here too.
On the gangway there, yes.
I don't actually like being categorised as one thing or another. I'm actually my own person, and I'm not a Thatcherite, I'm a nothingite. It's like I have my own beliefs. I don't live in the past. I'm looking towards the future. And I don't think there's anything to be gained by keep going over and over and over things that have already been debated for the last 20 odd years. And why don't we move on and look to the future? And we don't have to change everything like the recent coalition has done. As soon as you get into power, you've got to undo everything. And then you make a real mess of everything. And it costs more and more money.
Okay.
It costs more and more money.
Okay. And you, sir, in the middle, the third row from the back there.
Today it was announced in Liverpool that Anne Williams died of her illness. Her son died, Kevin died in Hillsborough. And he never saw justice because of Margaret Thatcher. And is Cameron's really suggesting that the people of Liverpool, Yorkshire, the miners, are Thatcherites? Because he's seriously deluded.
All right. I think we're...
Don't you think, though, in a funny way they are, because they seem to be unable to forget Mrs Thatcher, just as Michael doesn't seem to be able to forget her either. I just think, to a certain extent, we do have to try and bury the past and move on and accept that what we've done is move... one thing that is good that's happened, in a strange way, is we have moved slightly more to the middle. And it would be a pity if the current economic crisis drives us as a nation into a right and left position again. I think we are debating what works instead of where we stand in the political spectrum.
We're halfway through the programme. Michael, just a brief comment.
I just want to say a word about Hillsborough, because I care deeply about the 96 who lost their lives at Hillsborough. And I started an investigation internally when I was Home Secretary, which ultimately led to the further investigations. I can tell you this, that if Margaret Thatcher had known that the police had behaved as we now know they behaved at Hillsborough, she would have been at least as deeply shocked as you, sir, and as I.
OK. Do you want to have a say? Go on then.
I was just going to say, do you not think that regardless of sort of separate beliefs and everything, do you not think that still, like, for our sort of figurehead, our country's image, do you not think that that was a ridiculously kind of inflammatory thing to say at a time when the country's so divided?
What, for David Cameron to say?
It was... I actually haven't had a chance to answer this question, so very quickly, I think it was... I agree with you. I think it was a little bit silly. He should not have gone on your show and given an interview which looked as though he was trying to capitalise upon Lady Thatcher's death. And I think that...
It wasn't to me. It was on the radio.
Oh, so I apologise. I thought everything great appeared on your shows.
No, it does, but he said other things.
But he said that we're all Thatcherites now. We're not. I think Andrew Marr got it right with his History of the World show, and he said we're Thatcher's children because we're products of it. But not all children like their mothers.
Right. Let's go on. Lucy Ivy, a question from you, please.
Should vaccinations for children be compulsory?
Should vaccinations for children be compulsory? And this, of course, in the light of what's going on in Wales with the number of people who've not been vaccinated and are getting measles, and it is compulsory in some countries, in the United States in particular. Should it be compulsory here? Griff Rhys Jones.
No, I don't think it should be compulsory, but I think we are facing a very difficult thing with self-diagnosis. It's complicated for me. My father was a doctor, and he hated watching Dr. Kildare. He wouldn't allow us to watch it because the following day, you're all, many of you, too young even to remember Dr. Kildare, but the following, it's probably the same with Casualty, the following day his patients would arrive exhibiting exactly the same symptoms as they had seen in the programme. And I think what happened here was tragic and bad. And that is that a media debate started on the basis of some rather dodgy evidence which would have been better discussed by clinicians in the safety of their own hospital. And we've had another scare with the heart centre in Leeds, which was similarly discussed in the papers, that the evidence which should have been left to doctors to discuss privately became a public issue. When these things happen, people naturally become scared. And I think that's a pity. I was brought up to trust doctors, and to a certain extent, we should. Very difficult sometimes, because it's also true to say that there have been some terrible public health scares, and particularly in the 19th century, where it was newspapers that led the way.
But the idea behind this is that in the United States, I think there's the idea, in the United States, it's seen as a social duty to be vaccinated against measles, because if you're not, your child is going to give it to another child or to another child, and therefore you actually have a social obligation.
Well, it's complicated because there's an element of personal freedom here, but we also know that the use of antibiotics is now becoming a really dreadful problem, future problem for the world. And the idea of not using the law to control the use of medicines and is obviously becoming very, very complicated.
You, sir, over there. Yes.
I'm like Griff's father, I'm also a doctor, and I empathise with his sentiments regarding TV programmes concerning medicine and hospitals. But I would say that there is no ethical problem with compulsory vaccination. We already have laws in progress that allow the detention of people with communicable diseases who refuse treatment, such as tuberculosis, in hospitals. Counterbalanced with the severity of diseases like measles. Measles is a killer. There is absolutely no doubt about that. It kills young children. I mean, for me, there is no ethical problem that would, prevent me from administering compulsory vaccinations when one looks at the severity of the diseases involved.
Okay. The reason why we're talking about this is around, 10 years ago, a guy called Andrew Wakefield, was it Wakefield?
Yep.
Yeah. He decided, based on what was some dodgy research, that there was a link between
Which is
the
what
MMR
Griff was talking
vaccination
about.
and autism.
We know about that, because Griff was talking about that.
Yeah, but I'm just, and the guy has been found to be completely wrong. He was struck off by the GMC, and he's somewhere in America now doing something else. But the result of this is a combination of what he said. I'm afraid a combination of the influence of sections of the press, I'm afraid including the Daily Mail, and some politicians as well. We had around 70 cases, I think, 10 years ago of measles. It's now it's now up at around 2,000. And what we are seeing is the consequences of people not getting their children vaccinated, who are scared into doing it, and therefore a number of children in Wales and elsewhere now suffering.
But that's the background. What about the question? Which was, should they be made to be
the point about the question is this, is that in America, people aren't forced to vaccinate. Because there's a difference between saying you have to vaccinate and saying if your child isn't vaccinated, you can't come into a public school. There is a difference.
Is there a real difference?
I think there is a difference.
Not
because
for most people, surely, because you can't educate your children.
You're giving a choice to someone not to vaccinate, but there are consequences with that. But we used to have very high rates of vaccination, and the reason why they dipped is because of the scare stories that were put around about MMR. Even people, for example, who suggested we should have single jabs, there was an inference in that there was something wrong with the vaccination.
Yeah, but we know about the background, and I'm interested in your view about the ethics of saying to people, you say in the States you're only banned from public education, so you can go around the streets and still...
Right. That's right.
So it seems a rather weird thing to do, because you're not protected by going to a public school.
What I'm trying to clarify here, David, is it's not compulsory, but you're not allowed admission to areas where it could put children most at risk, and that's the public school system. What I'm saying is it is fair to have a debate about that. I'm not sure if that is the answer. I think the answer is to get back to where we were, which was high rates of take-up in every community in our country that brought measles down to 70 a year and was going down even further. But as a result of the scaremongering, as a result of newspapers being irresponsible and other individuals, a whole generation of kids did not get vaccinated, and they put a whole number of other people at risk.
Can I just say, this absolutely infuriates me. This is the reason it is a newspaper's responsibility, and I'm proud that the Daily Mail takes this very seriously, to report the facts. You know, there was a man who claimed...
He was struck off.
There was
struck off by the GMC.
He had struck off. At the time that he made these claims, they were taken as credible. As they were taken as credible.
They weren't taken as credible
ridiculous. They were taken by everyone as Caroline. Don't be silly, darling. It makes you just sound silly to say that.
I'm sorry.
It was run by every single. Can you just let me finish for a second, because you've been quite having a good time today. And there was one person who could have stood up, and we asked him again and again, could you please just say that you are sure that this jab is safe and that you will give it to your son? And that man was Tony Blair. Excuse me, just let me finish. That man was Tony Blair, and he refused to say whether or not he would give his own son the jab.
That was an immoral question to ask.
That could have doused the whole argument.
I'm sorry, but to suggest that people, public figures, should have to talk about what they give their children.
When there's a crisis of the level that you're describing now, 800 people.
Your newspaper helped to create the crisis, and you can't walk away from that.
Yes, but darlings, have we learnt our lesson? That's what I want to know. Now we've had the argument. Have we learnt our lesson?
It's newspapers' jobs to report what's going on.
The lesson is one at a time. I go back to the doctor, yes.
It's just regrettable that Amanda Platell's paper, their version of the facts bears very little evidence or very little kind of agreement with the actual science.
And it's the Daily Mail, the only newspaper you read, sir. It was covered by all newspapers, and in fact, the biggest one that's been laid the blame is one of the local newspapers, which I think is completely unfair.
With hindsight, do you regret the scale of coverage that the Mail gave? And it has to be said, some parts of the BBC covered this too. In a big way.
Nobody knew whether or not this was dangerous. Nobody knew. And if ever there's a health issue, you know, if there are things like people dying on the Liverpool pathway, if there are people, the elderly not being treated in hospitals, we see it as our duty to report that.
Okay, hold on,
and I hope we continue to do so.
All right, yes.
You said it was the newspaper's job to report the facts. The newspaper's job, at the end of the day, is to sell papers. So what you're doing isn't necessarily going to be fact. You're going to twist it to whatever way is going to make you sell the most copies.
All right.
And I think the Daily Mail has kind of perfected that.
Let's go away from the Daily Mail for the moment and come to the issue. Sarah Teather, should vaccinations for children be compulsory? Forget the history for a moment.
Okay. I mean, I'm not in favour of compulsory medication. I think if you start down that road, you know, goodness knows where on earth it will end. If we're going to deal with this, we need to actually understand science. And a lot of the problem with this debate, I'm afraid, Amanda, you're falling back into the same trap. I mean, to ask Tony Blair to say categorically whether something is safe, apart from the fact that you're putting a man and his child into the public, which is just completely unacceptable. Whichever party you're in, you have to think that that is completely unacceptable. But also, science doesn't proceed like that. Science proceeds on the basis of risk. And the problem with newspapers is that they report things as polarities. It's either completely safe or completely dangerous.
That is so not true, Sarah. I'm sorry. It shows, darling, that you're not a regular reader of the Daily Mail during that period.
That's possibly true, but I am also a scientist, and I did work for an organisation that for quite a long time tried to make sure. I worked for the Royal Society a long time before I was elected, and one of the big things we were involved in at that stage was talking about science advice. And the problem is people don't understand the scientific information they have. They don't know how to interpret it. So this type of thing happens over and over and over again. So to answer Griff's question, we haven't learnt our lessons, I don't think. We see scares all the time on the front page of newspapers with one report with half a dozen people treated as if it is true, when in fact scientific information just doesn't, doesn't proceed like that.
This man was a charlatan, wasn't he? He was. They decided in the end that he behaved dishonestly and irresponsibly. How could the Daily Mail know that? How could anybody know that until the thing had...
Well, it was a tiny study that was published in the Lancet. But of course, the claims he made... Listen, let me finish, David. Let me finish. But the claims he made were not made in the Lancet. They were made at a press conference later. You know, you can't just... I think we need to have... What would be really helpful is if something like this, if everybody sat and reflected on what's happened. We have 800 cases. We're lucky at the moment nobody has died. If people reflected and scientists and newspaper journalists came together and had a proper, sensible discussion about how we report scientific facts.
But there isn't an issue now about MMR. The question now is whether you're against compulsory...
I'm against compulsory.
All right, I want to go to the woman up there and then come to you, Michael Howard. Yes.
I did a little bit of research around the MMR when my daughter had to have it, and I did decide to give it to her, but I did also come across some information about the possibility of changing the ages at which the children receive their jabs so that it didn't coincide with the age that autism also began to appear in young children, so that we could, you know, effectively see and, you know, put out some research for parents or something to say, look, we've changed the ages where we give the MMR to children, and there is no, you know, we can categorically prove there's no link.
No, that's not the point she's making. The point is there was an apparent coincidence of autism and MMR.
That's what lots of people said.
Yes.
And if we
and
could
if you
somehow
separated
give
them, you could then see whether it was...
Yeah, separate them and give people sort of unequivocal proof that these two events happened separately, I think a lot more parents may be happy.
And are you in favour of compulsory vaccination? I mean, you say you vaccinated your children.
I don't know. I sort of... in a protective nature towards my own daughter, I'd sort of say, yes, I'd want as many children to be protected as possible.
Yes.
But then I also have a slight moral issue with compelling people to vaccinate their children against their will.
Michael Howard.
It is absurd in this context to demonise the Daily Mail. This controversy was covered by almost every newspaper. It was covered extensively on the BBC, and it continued to rage for quite a long time, despite the fact that Yvette Cooper, to her credit, who was, I think, Health Minister at the time, said that she had arranged for her children to be vaccinated. So it was a controversy, and in an ideal world, Sarah, things would happen as you've described, but they're never going to happen like that, because when controversies arise, you must expect the media to cover them.
But lots of
that was in the past. I agree with those who have said that it would be wrong to make it compulsory. I agree with Caroline. What we've got to try and do is get back to a situation where, on an entirely voluntary basis, the overwhelming majority of parents arranged for their children to have the vaccine, and I hope we can get back to that. The sooner the better.
All right. You, sir.
I never thought I'd find myself actually agreeing with a Liberal Democrat, but at the end of the day, surely the natural conclusion for things like that are this important, that are best understood by scientists, is that scientists and doctors should make the decision. And as a result of that, don't you agree that the natural conclusion is that compulsory vaccination is the way forward? And if we had compulsory vaccination, measles would be something we were discussing in the history.
I mean, I don't think you can abdicate all of the role of a politician to a scientist, and that's not what I was. That wasn't actually what I was arguing. Politicians still need to make decisions.
The woman at the very back.
But we need to understand the advice that they're giving. I don't think politicians always understand the advice that they're given from scientists.
The woman at the back there, and then I come to you, so then we'll go on. Yes.
I'm a new parent, so I've just been through this process myself of vaccinations, and I can say you're given a lot of information about the vaccinations, you know, so you know what you're doing, and I personally believe that getting your child vaccinated is the responsible thing to do, and I want to make sure there's any risks I can get rid of for my child, I can.
So if the parents of other children, your neighbours, weren't vaccinating their children, would you think they should be compelled to?
No, I think that you should want to do what is best for your child. I know that's an ideal world, and I think getting your child vaccinated is the best thing to do for your child, but I'm uncomfortable with the idea of the state forcing parents into a decision if they have a moral objection. I can't imagine what it would be like to have your child taken away and vaccinated against your will.
In any case, your child, once vaccinated, is protected anyway, so the issue barely arises.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
you say over there, yes.
I agree with the gentleman earlier on. He said, you know, that we have lots of different rules that are for the good of the community. You know, rules of the road, national curriculum.
Seatbelts?
Seatbelts. I see this as no different. For the good of the community, vaccinations like this should be compulsory.
Okay. You were going to pick me up on one point. I said if her child is vaccinated, child's safe.
If there are large numbers of people who aren't vaccinated, that can still have an impact in terms of these diseases on those who are. And there are some people, and I was talking to someone today, who knows someone who's got a small child who's got leukemia. They can't, because of their leukemia, get vaccinated. So they are not the herd immunity protects those people as well. And this is why these things are so important. It actually brings us together collectively in collective responsibility together, and we need to make sure that actually, you know, last time round, there were many, many, many more doctors and scientists saying it's safe, stick with the MMR, and we allowed an individual and a couple of others to take us off course.
Okay, thank you. Hannah Martin, please.
Does the threat from North Korea justify Trident?
Does the threat from North Korea justify keeping the Trident missile system? Who'd like to start on this? Griff Rhys Jones.
Thank you. We are, in a funny way, seeing the downside of the nuclear deterrent here, because it's complicated in as much as we live in a world which has been protected by these fearful weapons. But if we look back to the end of the Second World War, historically, had Adolf Hitler had nuclear weapons, he would have used them indiscriminately. because he was a madman. And to a certain extent, he believed at the end of the war that the German people had failed, and he wanted to take them and the rest of the world down with him if he could. And one of the problems about such dangerous weapons is that in the hands of people who are failing to rule their country, and they are a failing regime in North Korea, they become increasingly dangerous. Whether Trident will stop them ultimately taking some ghastly and terrible action is not necessarily any more true. I mean, in a way, it's a weapon which we know we should believe in to protect us from a sort of sense of mutual destruction. And to say that it hasn't is to misunderstand the post-war world. Because in a funny way, we have avoided, we've had a lot of war, but we've avoided really major wars like the Second World War, in which 68 million people, it's now estimated, died. And under those circumstances, it's an important thing.
For us to have, as well as for the United States to have.
Yes, I believe so.
Michael Howard, because Michael Portillo, the former Defence Secretary of the Conservative government, said it's absurd to believe the United Kingdom would use nuclear weapons against North Korea. If anybody's going to do it and provide a deterrent, it's the United States. Do you agree with that?
I don't think that's quite the point. The point is that we live in an extraordinarily uncertain world in which you cannot predict every eventuality that might occur. But let me give you a hypothetical example. We take it upon ourselves, normally together with other countries, to be prepared to intervene in certain circumstances for what we regard as humanitarian reasons. We did it most recently, together with the French, in Libya. Now, if Libya had still had nuclear weapons, then some people might have thought that Colonel Gaddafi might have been prepared to use them in those circumstances. I don't think he would have been prepared to use them. Why? Because he knew that we and the French had them. And you cannot discount the possibility that we might, for the very best of reasons, for humanitarian reasons, want to intervene in a part of the world which was within reach of North Korea's nuclear arsenal, and we might be deterred from intervening and achieving those humanitarian objectives if they had those nuclear weapons and we didn't. And so you've got to take into account the enormous uncertainty of the world in which we live, the fact that we can't predict all the likely situations that might arise, and that's why I believe we do need to keep our nuclear deterrent.
Yes, you.
I see the problem at the moment with maintaining an independent deterrent is that, well, the problem is cost, mainly, because it's highly expensive to develop, say, the submarines, which we do, which there are other ways you can do it, but high cost. But I do agree with Michael on this point that you can't predict the world. We've seen this with the Arab Spring, lots of countries changing into ways which we probably wouldn't like them to, such as we've seen in Egypt, lots of problems rising up there. We've seen in mainly in North Africa and so on. It's important to maintain it. But another point on North Korea will probably never use it. They're just trying to join this club of nuclear nations where they can try and be respected. But when their friends down south are more economically prosperous.
I think it was quoted, because it was something the Prime Minister said, that it was an example, a good example of why you might need a nuclear deterrent. Sarah Teather.
I mean, I'm not convinced that North Korea is the main threat to our security. I think the main threat to our security is terrorism, and it's from all sorts of random groups around the world. And for that, Trident is very poorly equipped. It is phenomenally expensive, as the gentleman here just said. And funnily enough, listening to what Michael was saying about Libya, I kind of drew a different conclusion, actually, that I fear that we just end up in an arms race, really, that countries with rogue governments think that the best way to protect themselves is to get nuclear weapons. And the argument was just going kind of round and round and round and round and round, that if they have nuclear weapons, we need more nuclear weapons. And I wonder whether or not actually this is a particularly sensible use of money at the time. I mean, we've had a debate all evening on and off. It's been the undercurrent of what we've been talking about. Has been about the financial difficulties we have in this country. And with what money we have, I wonder whether we might be better protecting ourselves in other ways and thinking about how we protect ourselves, particularly against terrorism.
You said that. Yes.
Sarah, I agree with your point around terrorism, but Trident is just part of a whole defence solution, and surely it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it.
Do you agree with him?
Yeah, I do agree with the last gentleman. I mean, the world is very different in many respects from the days of the Cold War, where we pointed at them and they pointed at us, and there seemed to be, despite everything and differences, certain rules of engagement. And I remember one senior person in the army said, well, you know, when it was the Cold War, it was like conducting a symphony orchestra. Since then, and all the other things that have occurred in terms of risk, it's more like jazz, because you just don't know what's going to happen and you've got to be prepared for all eventualities. I think what has happened since the end of the Cold War is that we have seen a reduction, I think, in the sort of stockpile of nuclear warheads, and I welcome that. But the truth is, I think it's not only for our benefit, but it's also the umbrella with other responsible nuclear nations that we provide a defence for other countries as well. And so therefore I think it's just part of what we have to deal with, but you're absolutely right, and so is Sarah. It isn't the only answer to deal with conflict, and it certainly isn't the only answer at all to deal with issues around terrorism that we face today and the many forms that that arrives in.
The woman there, and then I'll come to you, Amanda, and then I think I have to close. Yes, you.
I find there's a real sort of loss with what we teach our kids to turn the other cheek, and to, if a bully hits you, don't hit them back, and then we hold on to war weapons and nuclear things, so if they do it, we can do it. And it's something that we demonise them for having nuclear weapons, but it's okay because we have it, because we trust ourselves.
All right.
And I don't understand this imbalance of we're allowed to have it, but they're not.
Amanda Platell.
I don't think we need to.
I am unsurprisingly no nuclear expert, but I completely agree with this gentleman over here. There's a club out there of countries, some of them reliable, some of them completely fragile, and I would much rather be among the club of the, as you called it, the nuclear nations.
Okay. I'll take one more point. Who hasn't spoken yet? You haven't, sir. Down at the gallery. Briefly, please.
The lady at the end there said she'd rather be in the club of the nuclear nations, well, including the USA, who has destroyed cities with nuclear weapons. What sort of club is that?
Well, sorry, what cities is... in the Second World War?
Yes, Second World War.
Okay. Right, well, I think this is going to stop. I know you're very keen to speak, but all right, you could... What?
On the last question, I'd like to ask Griff Rhys Jones. You reckoned that Hitler was mad. Do you think the same of Harry Truman?
No, I think that what happened was that the use of the nuclear weapon was a restrained use of force at the end of the Second World War. I think it was an appalling use of force. But what that actually, that both those explosions have effectively put an end to the use of that weapon. And they have done, that nobody has effectively used another nuclear weapon in anger since that time. And I think in a way we bought a level of peace as a result of it.
All right.
And although that's a totally terrible thing for the world to have achieved, I think that happened as a result of those ghastly explosions.
You can't escape the attack. You cannot escape the attack on innocent men, women and children, civilians. There was no need for it at all.
All right. Time's up, I'm afraid. Thank you for the point. Next week we're going to be in Worcester, and Nigel Farage is going to be on the panel, and Robert Winston, the scientist and television presenter. Everybody seems to be a television presenter these days. Anyway, the week after that we're going to be in... It's a club. We're going to be in Dartford in Kent. Now, if you'd like to come to either programme, that's Worcester and Dartford. Go to our website, it's the best way of doing it, or you can call us 0330 123 99 88. Let us know your details, we'll get in touch. Thanks very much to our panel here. Thank you all for coming here to Aldershot. I know many of you don't live in Aldershot but have come here especially for this programme. I'm very grateful to you. We'll see you all again those watching at home next Thursday, I hope. From all of us here, good night.
Dust us out with Kim Woodall for a